Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to have a conversation with my friend Allan Lokos, who runs the Community Meditation Center in Manhattan, which opened in 2007, partially in response to the trauma that we all experienced as a community after 9/11. And I'm happy to be joined with Allan. Here he is. He's a best-selling author and a friend. Hi, Allan.
Hi, how are you, Thomas?
Everything is great here, getting by with our telecommuting and telemedicine and
Hmm.
adapting to change. How about yourself?
Same kind of idea, getting used to a different way of doing things, not being right there with people, but so far it's working.
It's strange to have social distance, right? We're herd animals, and it feels a little unnatural. And in my own experience, sometimes these Zoom meetings are refreshing because it feels like we're connecting across a great distance. I remember reading something from a Chinese philosopher about the reason that people raise their voice is because when we are trying to connect with another, we're crossing a great divide, and it's the forced connection in raising your voice to try to connect to another person. And it's pretty cool that we have technology that allows us to talk in two totally geographically separate areas from our own space. And it seems that for me to have some sort of a weird metaphysical vibe to it. I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
It does. I don't know if you're a fan of music or particularly a fan of opera, but I was just writing a piece before we got together about something that happened on Saturday. You know, the great music institutions, not just here in New York, but around the world, are essentially closed because people can't come into the music halls, they can't go to museums, etc. And the Metropolitan Opera did an extraordinary thing on Saturday, which was only possible because of this very kind of technology that we're using right now. They gathered 40 of the greatest singers in the world, but they didn't gather them in one place. They connected them electronically, and they were all over the world in their homes where they're also dealing with social distancing. And each one of them sang. This was a 4-hour gala. They each sang accompanied by their little smartphones or devices. So it was rather interesting to hear. You're used to hearing a big orchestra accompany an opera singer. These are these little tinny sounds coming out of devices. And it was amazing. But what makes me think of this, because of what you said, was at one point, the orchestra played a piece. It's an intermezzo from an opera called Cavalleria Rusticana. And the screen divided into 90 little tiny images of each of the musicians in their home playing their instrument, coordinated by the conductor in his home, conducting them, none of them able to see each other, although they could all see the conductor. And it was absolutely fantastic musically. But it just was this idea that even though right now we're separated physically from each other, we're still connected. And metaphorically, we can make music. We can.
That's right. You're an opera singer, right?
Well, that was
And
my background, yes.
well, that's where you come from. That space of
Yeah.
making music it's. I diddle with the piano a little bit. I'm not really, not even a very good amateur, to be honest. But it's music to me has, and I think to all human beings, music is transcends every possible background. But it is that beauty of being able to harmonize and bring together the silence and the sound and find a way to bring out something that we can all connect to, right? The connection is really the thing.
And it was extraordinary. I read in the Times, in the review Sunday, that the critic, who's been a critic on the Times for many, many years, was so moved. He had tears in his eyes. I had tears in my eyes, although separated by thousands of miles in some cases, they were so together. And I think
Such a
we're all,
difficult thing to do, right? Such a complicated. The timing has to be right, and to find that space together across such vast distance. A friend of mine is a music teacher, and his assignments to his students are trying to pair a duet at home with musical recordings that he's sending to them. So I know his students are having a hard time matching up the timing in the video format, but I can only imagine. How many instruments was it again, Alan? 80 or something?
they showed 90
90.
little
Wow.
tiles on the screen. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's
It was
impressive.
so moving because of, metaphorically, as I said, that we're not really separated, even though we're in different places. We're all in this together.
Yeah, that's a message I keep trying to drive home to my patients and my friends. And that's been the crux of what this video series has been about, is that we really are not alone in this. We are all alone together. And that is, that's becoming a theme that I think people are echoing. So in terms of ways in which we can nurture one another, what you just mentioned is fantastic. In your meditation center, I know you have a weekly service on Sundays and other retreats and meetings that happen. How have you been able to connect, or what are you encouraging people in your community to do to connect to one another? Aside from this musical thing that you just mentioned, is there any other recommendations that you have for people in terms of connecting with one another?
Well, we're very fortunate in that through the years, we've developed a bigger and bigger community, more and more people participating. And now I guess just because it's easier, one doesn't even have to get up and go out of the house. Um, the numbers have been enormous, hundreds of people attending each Sunday session. And then from the teacher's perspective, my teacher colleagues, often I have to wait. Let's say there's a teacher we'd really like to have who is in California. Now we don't have to wait for when they're in New York. We just say, hey, let's set up a date for you. And the teachers have been great. Teachers are just giving and giving of themselves. And it's a difficult thing to suddenly start being a meditator or learning how to deal with a difficult situation or a changing situation suddenly when you haven't really practiced doing that. So a lot of what we're doing is introducing initial tools, ways to get started. Getting started in a meditation practice, just to use one example, although I think this would be true of any contemplative practice, essentially it starts with stopping. Sounds odd.
That is such a great point, Alan, because as you were talking about your meetings, and we are having the same experience at Columbia, where our meetings are more well attended right now than they've ever been. And people are a bit more available because we've had to slow down. We're forced into this space of hurry up and wait, kind of stop and pay attention. And I think that's sort of the root of mindfulness, right? Is that attention. So I didn't mean to interrupt your thought. I hope you can get back to it, but I really wanted to draw attention to the blessing that we have, which is this ability to connect, and how suddenly, because we've been forced to stop, we're finding new ways to connect with one another. Because I really think that's a super important point for people to take home from this, is that we can always find the dark cloud and find that silver lining, to speak in cliches, but the silver lining of this stoppage has been the recognition of how important it really is to have the physical relationships, but how available we really can be to one another, even across great distance. So tell us more about this idea of stopping in order to draw attention.
I think it comes very much from what you just said, and I'm in complete agreement with you. I remember working with a young woman a number of years ago. She was still in her 20s. Her mother had died just recently of breast cancer, and now she was diagnosed also with breast cancer. And she said something to me at that time that I always remembered. She said, when I'm finished with this illness, I'm not going to go back to where I was. Because if I don't go forward, if I don't learn something from this, there really will have been no point to going through an illness. Now, it sounds a little strange because she didn't make the choice to have to go through the illness, but she was able to see that she could actually benefit from this. She didn't want the illness. I don't think any one of us wants to be dealing with a pandemic, but here we are, and here it is. Now, how are we when we come out, when we're on the other end? What have we learned? What do we gain? How do we move forward in a way that that benefits us? And I don't mean just that our business works better or that our practice is better, but I mean benefits us as human beings. What have we learned individually? So there's more involved right now if we choose. There's more involved than just sitting around and waiting until we're told, okay, it's safe to go outside now. It's looking at what our experience is in each moment. And, to speak about each moment is a very difficult thing to do. So let's just say, as often as we can think, to say, what am I experiencing right at this moment? And not be afraid of what it is. Maybe I'm scared at this moment. Maybe I'm anxious at this moment. Maybe I'm angry at the person who was walking past me without their face covered and looked like they were snickering at me. And whatever it is that we're experiencing, can we practice being aware, being present to what I'm experiencing right now? And as you said, that's really the initial step in the practice of mindfulness.
Yeah, I love that. You said so many great things there. One of them being that on the hero's journey, and we're all the heroes and heroines of our own story, or at least we want to be, or we're working to be. And there really is no growth without adversity. The moth can't spread his wings unless he squeezes out of the cocoon. And we really, like the phoenix rises from the ashes, right? The story is told in mythology over and over again about how adversity shapes us. And everything is a learning experience if we're paying attention. I think that at the beginning of this, many people set some expectations for themselves that they would use this time for X, Y, or Z. And maybe it was spending more time with their kids, or maybe it was getting to that book that they were writing, or maybe it was starting an exercise regimen, or maybe people approached it mindlessly and said, we'll just see how long this goes on. And at some point or another, the realization may come that this has gone on far longer than we thought and may continue to go on for an indefinite period of time. And there can be angst and a sense of loss of control. And if you're not aware of that, if you're not paying attention, there is no room for growth. There is no opportunity for growth. So do you have any tips or tricks for people to start to tune in the attention? And I think when people think of meditation, anybody who's ever tried it has that moment of, am I doing this right? What am I supposed to be seeing? What am I supposed to be feeling? So what advice do you give beginners? And we're all beginners in some sense, but what things can you do when those thoughts creep in? What tips and tricks do you have for the person trying to be aware so that they can start to make some adjustments?
Well, let's take it from what you just said. You're not doing it right. But then again, you're also not doing it wrong, because this is one of the oddities about this kind of practice that we call meditation. There isn't a right or a wrong way. We have some early teachings that go back more than 2,500 years. They're quite specific, but in a way, they're also kind of obvious. In a very early teaching that was offered by the Buddha, which in English translation is called Foundations of Mindfulness. He starts with something very obvious. He says, go to a quiet place. So specifically, he says, go to a forest, to the root of a tree. That doesn't really work all that well for us New Yorkers. But the rest of that sentence is, he says, or a quiet place. And that's also not necessarily all that easy for New Yorkers, but most of us have a corner of a room where we can go and just sit and get quiet. Maybe tell anyone else who's at home with us that I'd like a few minutes of quiet. And in turn, I'll give you a few minutes of quiet. And then he says, in that quiet place, sit down. Now, back in those days, people were probably small. And to say, and fold the legs in what is traditionally called a lotus position, one leg over the other. But just sitting down is fine, standing up is fine, meditation while walking is fine, while lying down is fine, as long as you don't fall asleep. So there's a lot of leeway. But then comes a key sentence when in these instructions it says, and bring your awareness or cultivate mindfulness in front of you. So actually the way we interpret that is to say at the tip of the nose. And what he's saying there is it's at the tip of the nose or just inside the nostrils that we can notice the in-breath and the out-breath. So if you want to try something, Thomas, I'll show you this. If you take a couple of very quick breaths like this, you'll notice right near the tip of the nose at the front, you can feel the air rushing in. Yes, try once more. Right? So
Yeah,
now if you slow
absolutely.
that down and just breathe normally, but focus on that same place, and just try to do that twice. You might notice, you might not, but you might notice that with the inhalation, the air is slightly cooler than it is with the exhalation. Pretty obvious reason for that. Inhalation, the air comes from outside. Now the air is within you and is being warmed within the body. So the exhalation may appear to be a bit warmer than the inhalation. Absolutely mundane. But here's the thing. Try to do that with 3 breaths and staying focused just on the sensations that is caused by the in-breath and the out-breath. Come on, let's take a shot at it together. All right? 3.
Sounds good. Ready?
Here we go. Now, if we were practicing this together, which in a way we are, I would ask you what other thoughts cross through your mind. And you might say, well, none really. And then we'd look a little more deeply and we'd find, I mean, for a moment I thought about, or I was looking at the screen or thought about something I have to do right after this, or something someone said right before this, which was really annoying. I don't know why he said that. And this is what the mind does. Now, this relates back to when I said you're not doing something wrong or something right. This is about noticing what is happening, not correcting something, not fixing something. There's nothing to fix because there's nothing broken. But we're just watching the nature of mind. And the nature of mind is to wander.
Do you agree with the concept that when the mind wanders, or you're using your breath in this instance as the object of your meditation, and we could easily use other objects like a Zen wheel or something else, but you can use exercise as an object. You can use lots of things, but the 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 idea that when the mind wanders, or when you go to a place uh, unwillfully, that it's the coming back to the attention that really is the practice. That concept for me has been really powerful. This idea that the practice isn't getting it right or wrong, or as you're saying, there is no right or wrong. It's just drawing the attention. But as your attention wanes and you start to become less conscious, like when you're on a long drive and you pass an exit and you say, well, how many exits did I pass where I wasn't aware of the number of exits that I was passing?
Mhm.
Uh, and then you come back and you say, well, now I'm acutely aware of my position and where I am. Where was I before that? But that idea, that moment of coming back, can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's been a very powerful part of my practice.
Yeah, that's the key moment, because that is a moment of mindfulness. That's the moment when you realize, oh, I was someplace else. One of the keys in working with that moment is, one, not to become judgmental. Oh, I'm a bad meditator because that happened. No, you're a wonderful meditator because you've just experienced that moment of awareness. And that is the beginning of the practice of mindfulness. So rather than being critical, you just invite the mind back to, if we're working with the sensations of the breath, invite the mind back to the next in breath. As you rightly called that, the object of concentration or the object of focus. But yeah, that's the key moment. That's the moment when we are actually awake. This practice is really not about um, becoming less stressful. There's an enormous uh, emphasis on reducing stress today, on being calmer. And it's true that as the mind becomes more focused, we are actually alleviating stress, because the mind, there isn't stress in a moment of pure focus. But that's really only the beginning. What we're coming close to experiencing is a sense of being awake, of
Mm.
being aware, of being um, liberated in a sense, knowing freedom, becoming freer of the ways in which we trap ourselves and really imprison ourselves. And I think a number of people that I've spoken with just in these last few weeks are experiencing for the first time that they really do imprison themselves in a cage of non-beneficial thinking. And it's an amazing awakening when we realize that.
And isn't that a message that transcends? We're talking about Buddha here, and we're talking about basic meditation principles, but it's the act of letting go of the attachment. That's been, I guess, every prophet in history, especially if you look at the prophet Jesus, and the fact that he talked about this idea of letting go and transcendence and forgiveness, right? So I think if we set an expectation in our mind of what we're trying to become, or what we're trying to achieve, or what we're trying to let go of, and we don't accomplish that task, there's this attachment to that failure. And I think I hate to use the word successful, but to achieve the flow state that you described, where your awareness and your being in tune allows that. It's not a relaxation state necessary, but maybe a flow state to come to be. You have to let go of those attachments. And it's only in bearing witness and being aware of what's happening around you and accepting things for what they are and understanding where you can meet those things that that's possible. So I want to transition to bearing witness if we can. But before we get there, there was a story you told me that I think is really going to help to set the foundation for the ability to bear witness in this very difficult time. And it was that story where you're patient when you're a chaplain. So you're an author, you're an opera singer, you've got all these great hats that you wear, but you're also a hospital chaplain. Is that right? And there was a patient that you remember, and you talked to me about. I think he called you Al or something.
Hmm. That's a story that so many people love. And I did volunteer as a chaplain when I was in seminary studying to be an interfaith minister. That was years and years ago. So I was a volunteer, and all the other chaplains, of course, were part of the staff. And they would walk into rooms. They had their book in their hand, whatever their particular faith or path was that they were following. I had no books in my hand. It was just me. And so I did meet this one patient. Now it happens, as I told you, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, we may share this in common, that I was born in Brooklyn.
Everybody's from Brooklyn. We're all from Brooklyn originally. Yeah.
All right. Now I feel much better about being from Brooklyn, knowing that you are also. So I met this patient, a gentleman, in bed, and I knew instantly he was a Brooklynite also, because I introduced myself. I said, my name is Allan, and I'm with the chaplain's office. And he said, oh, Al, yeah, good to meet you, Al. Nice to meet you. A lot of the guys from the chaplain's office have been coming by, but why don't you sit down, because, actually I have something I would like to talk to you about, Al. My wife and the kids want me to take another round of chemo, you know what I mean? And, Al, that stuff is really difficult. You take that, you see hair falls out, and I said to him, I don't see that as a big problem. But he says, well, yeah, but I do, you know what I mean, Al? So I don't know, and then I don't feel very good. And, the truth is, I don't have that much time anyway. So I'm thinking, why should I do this chemo? But the wife, the kids, they keep saying, do it, you gotta do it. So I don't know what to do, Al. Can you tell me, what should I do? And I said to him, well, I think the only thing I can tell you for sure is I believe that you will make the wisest decision for you. And I left. And when I came back the next week to see him, he greeted me with a big smile and he said, Al, it's good to see you. I just wanted you to know I'm following your advice and I'm going to do the chemo.
Isn't that great how listening is a method of communication? I think that's the point of the story, right? You heard the person, you were actively engaged, you allowed him to speak his mind, divulge his concerns, and there is something to listening. And I think that's the point of the story. And that old proverb, I think it's a Hebrew proverb, you have two ears and one mouth so that you listen twice as much as you speak.
If only.
But we don't often do that, right? We're hanging on the next word, thinking about what we're going to say in response rather than actively listening. I think that's the thing we should focus on is what does it mean to be an active listener? How does one communicate with their eye contact and with their engagement, and is that part of drawing attention, and how is that part of communication?
Excuse me for interrupting when I did. I think in the case of this gentleman, he heard from me. It didn't matter that I said it or not, but he heard from me that you have permission to make your own decision and to do what you feel is best. And maybe other people weren't allowing him room to do that.
You
the
also gave him the sense that there was a wisdom in himself, right? I think that's what you're saying there, that if he,
absolutely,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
the wisdom is there. You gave him the opportunity to hear himself and to see his thoughts outside of himself, reflected back from you.
It's a really terrible thing that so many people go through an entire lifetime without ever being heard.
Hmm.
There's just no one who is interested in what they truly had to say. So the development of listening skills, and they definitely are skills, is such an incredible gift that we can offer to people. There are specific exercises, if you go through the kind of training that I have, or um, actually, I think I had mentioned to you one time that I had done some teaching at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And this is one of the things that I was teaching, that if we listen to another person and we've determined in advance that we're not going to verbally respond to what they say for at least 5 seconds or 3 breaths, we will listen differently. If we look at our minds when we believe that we're listening to another person, we'll see that we're most often preparing a response, deciding if we agree or disagree, judging, evaluating. But are we really listening? Or are we making an assumption after the first 3 or 4 words the person says that I know what they're going to say? So I now move into my own thought process. This exercise of determining that you're not going to respond. The way we used to do it when we were practicing was you didn't respond. We'd work in dyads or triads, and you'd work with another person, and one person would be the listener, the other person would be the speaker. The speaker speaks, the listener listens, but the listener doesn't respond. I will admit to something that I learned, and I learned how much the ego is at play.
Hmm.
Someone speaks and they're telling me of their problem they've been having for years and years, and they've gone to this famous therapist and this well-known psychologist, and they've read all these books, and no one has been able to help them. And I'm sitting there thinking, I want to be the person who helps them. I want them to say, oh, Allan, this is great. You're the first person who really understood and was able to help me. And when you see something like that within yourself, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, or you're doing something wrong. It means that you're watching the nature of mind. And you try to watch it in a non-judgmental way. And if there's reason to do so, you say, I can do better than that. I can be of more benefit to people if I work this way rather than the way that I've been working. Then we make progress and we grow. But to be a person who really listens, that is a tremendous gift to the world.
And it's difficult. It is a difficult skill, and it does take practice. The uh, story that comes to mind for me is Palm Sunday last year. I took a vow of silence for 24 hours just to play with it and see what would happen. And I didn't tell anybody, but they figured it out very quickly. And what it taught me was that language is such a powerful gift. The words that we share between one another have such power. And without a single word, you can communicate so much. And if we are just a bit more aware of how much meaning people take from the things we say, we might more actively listen to what others are trying to say to us, so that we can see past some of the superficial things and see into maybe what they're really trying to communicate, which is, I think, in my opinion, people think of themselves as good communicators or great communicators. And I know that I used to think of myself, and it's almost like in anything, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And with practice, I think I've gotten better, but I also realize that communication is not a perfect skill, and that to be a really great communicator, you have to start with being a really great listener. And it is not as simple as it sounds. It requires a tremendous amount of patience. And you talked about ego, and I think that that's a really interesting point, because right now, we've all been faced with that situation in medicine, no matter what space you're coming from as a healer, whether you're a nurse or a PA or a physician, or whether you're the person who greets patients at the front desk. There's a part of you that wants to satisfy and help that other person. That's a human quality. But in the healing arts, it's even more so that you want to be able to give that person what they're looking for. And sometimes you can't. And that is a terribly painful experience. So I would love for you to talk a bit about your experience in the plane crash and the book you authored in regards to that, about the suffering you experienced and your relationship with your physicians at that time, in terms of their ability to share with you the suffering that you had undertaken and help you to find ways to move forward, because there was no miracle cure in that moment.
Yes, yes, the plane crash. So we're going back 7.5 years, and we're going to the other end of the world, to Burma, or Myanmar, if you wish. My wife and I were semi on holidays, studying, little teaching, and an internal flight, city to city within Burma, was supposed to take about 45 minutes. Commercial airline, there was 73 people on board, and officially the government declared this was pilot era. The plane came down way before the runway, and on the way down, one of the wings sliced through heavy electrical cables, which sparked and set the plane on fire. So that when we hit the ground really hard, the plane was really engulfed in flames, and within the plane, thick black smoke. A lot of panic. There were fatalities. My wife and I were sitting pretty far back, and as we tried to get to the front, she said to me, she's never going to make it. She was already choking on this thick black jet fuel smoke. We saw that there was a door, an emergency door open to our left, and although it was engulfed in flames, we figured if we just jumped through it very quickly, we might get slightly singed, but we would be okay. So we moved toward there. I gave her a big push, and out she went. My intention was to follow right after her, but my foot caught on something. To this day, and I never will know what it was because of the smoke, I couldn't see it, but I was caught there, and I was actually standing in the flames. But I want to interject something here for people watching and listening. I'm okay. See that? Yeah, a little damage to the hands, little irregularity from skin grafts, lot of burn damage, 33% of my body to what is now called by the medical world full thickness burns. I hope you verify that is correct.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, first, second, and third degree, I don't think is the terminology used anymore.
Right.
So pretty serious business, to the extent that doctors have a formula. They add your age to the percentage of your body that has been seriously injured through burns. If you get up near 100, that is really dangerous. If you reach 100, very little chance that you survive. And I was well over 100, not in age, but adding those two together. So we began, thanks to my wife, I'm going to talk about heroes. She was badly injured, fractures in her back and a lot of pain, but still managed to get me out of Burma, which was not the wish of the Burmese government. They would have liked us to been put over in a corner. They were trying to have sanctions lifted at that time, so it was not really great to have Americans injured this way. But we did get out. We got to Hong Kong next. No, we got to, yeah, Hong Kong was next. Then came Singapore, where there's a major burn unit, biggest burn unit in that part of the world. Doctors in all of these places concurred, no way to survive these injuries, yet I kept staying alive. Great, great doctor in Singapore did some amazing grafting and surgery. Medevaced to New York, and again in the hands of fantastic doctors, although they all told my wife, they didn't say it to me, but they said little chance that he will survive. And yet, to cut through all of that, here I am, grateful, wanting to use this time that I have for whatever good that I can do. Oddly enough, the greatest period of suffering was not so much in the hospitals and dealing with those burns and injuries directly, probably because I was not conscious that much of the time. But when I was finally released from the hospital and came home, I think I expected that everything was now going to be fine. And that was far from reality. I had no use of my hands. I couldn't walk. Completely, I looked like a mummy encased in bandages. And I was totally dependent on other people. And as someone who likes to care for other people, being dependent was very difficult for me to adjust to. But we spoke just a few minutes ago about relinquishing and learning to let go. I
Yes.
had to learn how to let go and let other people care for me. I would remind myself often that I would want to care for them. I need to let them right now care for me. Without an ability to do that, I would not have survived. I learned how to accept care, how to be fed, how to be showered, how to have everything done for me.
As a caretaker, Alan, as somebody who was and is used to taking care of others, what is the process of gaining compassion for yourself like in terms of suffering so much and holding the space to be able to have the capacity to deal with all that suffering? What is it like in terms of letting go and letting others care for you?
Difficult. Truly, it was difficult.
Why?
I remember saying over and over again, I want my life back. I had a good life, a wonderful wife, we have a nice home, we do things. I like the work that I do, and just I wanted my life back.
But why so hard to let somebody care for you? This is a thing I think most caretakers battle, and even right now, especially with COVID, with so much suffering that healthcare workers are bearing witness to, and then having to come home with carrying that burden. It's sometimes hard to let go and admit that they're suffering. And I think that's one of the big reasons that people burn out, physicians and nurses and people in the critical care units that are seeing all of this suffering. Even our workers who handle the dead, they have such a burden at this time. So how do those folks lean on others in a healthy way? How do they find compassion for themselves to open themselves up to finding caretakers and allowing people who want to take care of them to do so?
Well, as I said, I think it's difficult. There are many feelings related to that, and they come rapidly. Uh, First of all, we're in a position that we don't want. In the teaching that I was quoting before, where the Buddha teaches one how to meditate, he said that one of the primary causes of suffering, and this sounds very obvious, is not getting what you want and getting what you don't want. None of us want to be in the position of either being a patient or in these incredible people, you and your colleagues, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies, the caretakers. Nobody wants to be in these positions. To care for people under, let's say, what we would call normal circumstances, sure. But when they're coming by the hundreds and even by the thousands, and you don't have sufficient time and you don't have sufficient materials, and we don't even know all that we need to know about what we're dealing with, is highly stressful. So for the caretakers, I think we'll go back for a moment to something we spoke about before, just simply stopping. And I stop for 5 minutes, and I mean completely stop, not just the body, but the mind as well. Can I go out to the nearest place that has some grassy ground? Is there some place where I can hug a tree? Is there some place where I can get a delicious sandwich? Is there some place where I can chat with a colleague, even if he or she has to be 6 feet away? That self-care, that taking time out, because we can get caught up in, there isn't time for that. There isn't time for me to care for myself. And we don't want to get caught up in that. If we don't care for ourselves, how do we care for others? But it's, I keep going back and saying it's difficult, because in my own experience, I know that it's difficult. If there's someone I can help, I had my first phone call before 8 o'clock this morning. And what am I going to do? I'm not even interested in saying, look, I haven't had breakfast yet. Tell me what's going on. Let's see what we can do to help. But at a certain point, I will say, okay, for the next hour, I will not be answering the phone, or I'll not be good for the rest of the day. Each of us has to learn about our own capacity, especially if we're really being overworked at this time. And that goes for our capacity to take in the news. Take in small amounts of the news. I mean, do you really have to read to the bottom of the article? Isn't it enough that one person died, that one person is suffering? Do we need to know all of the statistics? It doesn't change the tragedy, it only amplifies it. So
there's a tiny thread in there that I don't know if it's apparent, but hopefully this comes across. But there's this thread of people want to help and they want to understand things, and so healthcare workers obviously are going to be running into the situations that they trained for and maybe resisting the urge to rest. And we've all experienced that, especially in residency and training programs. And our residents at Columbia are heroes, and across this country right now, residents are stepping up probably as much or more than anybody as far as covering the wards and taking care of the sickest people. But the idea of stopping, this internal awareness, we are exquisitely designed to know what we need. Caretakers need to take care of others, but we also need to pause and take care of ourselves. That's what you're saying. But if you don't ever stop, you won't have any intuition or any sense of what you're lacking in this moment, and you won't bring your best self to the front lines, and you won't make the best decisions. So I think it's a really important point to emphasize, which is the cliche: put the oxygen mask on yourself first. Quiet the mind, take some time, really pay attention to what you need, because if you don't, you're going to run yourself into the ground. And I love that there's a hint of that in what you're saying, but I really want to just kind of throw an exclamation point on it and really drive it home, because it is so hard for caretakers to stop. And for people at home, I think it's really hard for them to stop. Why do they read to the end of the article or the end of the newspaper, or scour the internet for more and more information, trying to discover the latest, greatest drugs? Because they feel like they can do something. And unfortunately, the reality is many people burn themselves out that way. And they're not being true to themselves. They're not being honest with themselves about their limitations and their skills.
Let me ask you something then. In all of your years of study, medical training, internship, did anyone teach you this?
No. So this was the kind of thing that, as director of wellness, at some point or another, obviously I showed signs to the people that I work around that this is a forte of mine personally. And I guess my leadership, Bill Levine and Mike Vitale, are the two guys that really approached me to do this director of wellness job. There was a moment in my own existence, and for me, I had been injured. I had had concussions playing football, and that's how I found my way to sports medicine. But I was also the kind of person that really never saw limitations and just kept pushing and pushing. And for me, the rising from the ashes was in burning myself completely out in every possible way. And so, having gone through that experience, I was forced to learn skills to help myself, because there really were no loud voices at that time screaming, "Hey, docs are burning themselves out. We need to pay attention to this." So that's really, the thing that I'm focusing on now with you, and that you're drawing out for me, is really the heart of why I wanted to do this, is to get healthcare workers to recognize the fact that we can't save everybody, and we're gonna do our damnedest, and we're gonna fight as hard as we can. But if we don't slow down in moments to take care of one another, take care of ourselves, that can be equally dangerous. And for people at home, I see so many of my friends struggling with this. When hydroxychloroquine was on the front of the newspaper, and then high altitude pulmonary edema was on the front of the newspaper. And now these two docs out in California propagating false information about the death rate being lower than influenza, and people trying to help because they're worried about business owners and mental health. I see people burning themselves out and driving themselves into a corner where there is no escape. So who teaches these skills? You teach this skill, in your meditation center. You saw the need in cops and firemen. And it's these types of conversations that I hope will open the eyes of others who are battling right now to do their best from whatever space, whether it's healthcare, or whether it's a seamstress who's making masks, or whether it's a sanitation worker who has to get out there and collect the garbage and needs to protect himself with a mask and gloves. That's the idea is we have an opportunity to be heroic, but being heroic doesn't mean jumping into a space that you can't function appropriately in. It means meeting the road from where you are. And I'm sorry to hijack the conversation, but I hope that makes some sense.
No, you're absolutely right. I know that in many of the hospitals now, I and my colleagues are teaching contemplative practices. Mine, of course, is meditation. I worked with the police department in Brooklyn, and just this morning, this is such a great story, I received a little video from a colleague, this wonderful young woman who is, I guess just by her nature, as an organizer. I met her when she was organizing the first retreat ever for survivors of gun violence. and she asked me to be part of that. And so we went. And I know you know our mutual friend, Sharon Salzberg.
Yes.
Sharon and I and my wife, who was a trauma therapist, we went to Florida, but we did this retreat in Massachusetts. So this young woman in Florida, several weeks ago, no more than 4 weeks ago, in her local community, joined the sort of wealthier people and teamed them up with others in the community who were in need of ways to just buy groceries and needed some financial help. And her community responded beautifully. And lo and behold, this began to catch on and spread all across the country. So this morning, she sent me a video that her husband made of her answering the phone, and the voice on the other side said, "Good morning, Shelley. This is Joe Biden." And this was indeed Joe Biden calling to offer his congratulations and praise for the work that she was doing. So this kind of thing is recognized. It is being offered in hospitals. Firefighters, police need it, really need it, so we can do the work that it is that we want to do, so that we can be of benefit, all of us.
Yeah, and there's such great, beautiful simplicity in that, right? Just starting something from a place of very focused and intentional energy, and how that can really transcend barriers and expand to meaningful work. But it starts with an idea and a place that's within reach. And that's the thing I've encouraged my friends in financial industry or medical industry or whatever industry they're coming from, to think about what their skill sets are and how that skill can help in this particular crisis. What can you do from your space with your expertise to make this a little less painful? We've got to get back to work. We've got to get back to doing the things we love. We can't be cooped up forever, but how can we do that in a meaningful and a methodical and a mindful way, so as to reduce the suffering of many thousands of people in terms of infection and death? So I'd like to end on the bearing witness concept. I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means from a crisis standpoint in terms of populations of people. And that term came to my attention when I read The Dude and the Zen Master, which is The Big Lebowski, which is a cult classic, great movie. But Jeff Daniels is the right name of the actor, I think. Or no, it's not Jeff Daniels.
I didn't see the movie, so I can't help.
Oh, you've got to see it. So now this will be the homework of everybody watching this video, to correct me on the name of the actor. But The Big Lebowski, the actor wrote a book with a Buddhist Zen master, and in that book, this concept of bearing witness to the Holocaust comes up. This idea that when there's so much widespread suffering, even if you're not directly impacted, the circles of suffering expand out, and we suffer with one another. Being communal animals as we are, and sharing in our herd means that we do have this empathy, this compassion that allows us to sort of feel one another's pain. So in this time where that is true, there is so much suffering, not just directly in the disease, but people who are suffering at home, kids who aren't fed because of lack of resources, domestic abuse that you read about, the mental illness that people are suffering from. And it transcends the disease of direct impact. How can we individually and then collectively work together to bear witness? How can we be more aware of this and find ways to effectively or meaningfully bear witness?
I think we start slowly, rather than trying to jump in with the feeling that perhaps I'm the one who can save the world. Going back to that time when I did some work as a hospital chaplain, I found that work difficult. not so much in the dealing with the patients that I visited. I was in the ward that dealt with pancreatic cancer, and the patients were fantastic. But I had difficulty, and I learned to own up to this. I had difficulty dealing with sights and smells that were difficult for me to take in. So I went slowly, and it got so that I realized I can do this. I can deal with what I'm seeing. I can deal with what I'm smelling. I can deal with what I'm hearing. And ultimately, I wanted to be there, even though it was difficult. I would say to this day, probably the most difficult couple of years that I can remember, more than my own time of being injured. Each day going to the hospital, I dreaded it. And each day leaving the hospital, I felt so uplifted for what I had been able to see and to experience in that day. So I would start by saying, you go slowly, and going back to something we spoke about before, pay attention to what is going on within you in terms of what is going on in your thoughts, in your physical sensations. They're not to be dismissed just because you're not proud of them, or because you feel I shouldn't be thinking that. You are thinking what you're thinking, but now how do you act? That's the important thing. But trying to dismiss or deny what you're feeling is not only not useful, it can ultimately be unhealthy. So aware of what your experience is, you walk in slowly where you can help. You know, the term bearing witness was used as the title of a book by a Zen teacher named Bernie Glassman, who died only 3 or 4 years ago, I'm going to guess. He used to lead 2 kinds of retreats that I knew about. One was a retreat that took place during Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving time, and he took people to Auschwitz. And the retreat was each day walking the road down to a camp where people were executed, exterminated. And they sat the full day around that camp. They sat in circles, and then toward the end of the day, they recited names of people who had been killed in that camp. Another retreat that he led was to teach you to be a street person in New York City. You were a homeless person for a week. You started out with no money in your pocket, and your survival depended on what you could get from other people. I never got to do the New York City homeless retreat. That I think would have been quite interesting. But these are, these are not beginner exercises. This is not a starting place. Your starting place is, I'll tell you an exercise that I have suggested many, many times. For 1 week, and 1 week only, this is an important part of the exercise, that it's done over a limited time period. Whenever you leave your house, you carry with you 5 $1 bills. And if 5 $1 bills is too much, you can carry 5 quarters. The amount is not important, but that the amount is exactly the same is important. And each day, when you walk through the streets, and we'll have to now imagine when we can again walk in our streets, when someone approaches you with a handout, you simply give them one of those dollars. You don't think about it, you don't consider, you don't judge, you don't evaluate. This is just the practice of giving. And then the important part of the practice, you stop and spend a moment with that person face to face, and you have a little conversation. It could be as simple as, how are you doing? How are you feeling today? And you listen to the answer. And then when you leave, you say, I wish you well. I hope you're warm enough. More times than not, the response that you get is something like, God bless you. Now, New Yorkers like bargains. Blessing for $1, that's a bargain. And the end of that exercise is, notice how you feel as you walk away. Now, this is not about making this your way of life. You might not want to do that. It's limited time, a week, or 3 days if a week is too much. But notice what it feels like to simply give, to be with that other person in a conversation. Person might not smell all that good, might not be particularly grateful for your dollar or your quarter. But what is your experience? What's going on within you? And that's also the practice of mindfulness.
It sure is. And that point, I think, is a great place to end. I think that what you're saying is so important for every single individual person who's going to listen to this, not just healthcare workers and people in hospitals, but the people they're coming home to, the people in their community. If we could all spend a moment listening to one another a little bit more deeply, I think that we would understand the true meaning of being one. We really do all want the same kinds of things. We really all do share in the same joys and sufferings. And incidentally, Bernie Glassman is the person who wrote the book, The Dude and the Zen Master, with
okay.
Jeff Bridges, not Jeff Daniels, Jeff Bridges, one of the Bridges brothers. And yeah, so that does ring. As you were talking about the trips to Auschwitz, the vision came back in my head. And I said, I have to look up this this book before we end this interview, because yes, it was Bernie Glassman. So anybody who's interested in that concept, I'm sure they can get a lot more from the books that you've written, and certainly from the Community Meditation Center. And I'll put some links in the show notes so that people can connect and have a way to find your center, your books, The Dude and the Zen Master. And hopefully we can all do a great job of bearing witness in this time, so that we can really lift one another up rather than tearing each other apart.
I'm with you, and you stay healthy.
Thank you, my friend.
All right.
All right. Be well, be safe. I'll see you soon.